I think that's an interesting question for Labour, because you constantly, in the middle of that graph was economic decisions made by Liz Truss. That's something that you hear Labour want to talk about all the time, as if that is the very top thing. I think that graph in itself, not to read too much into it, but showed they have quite a difficult challenge when it comes to young people and trying to persuade them that is the thing that is to blame. Actually, I think they have more complex views about the economy. But generally, I thought it was a very interesting and nuanced and complex view, which showed how young people do have quite complicated views on these things.
I mean, that point on the Liz Truss episode and attitudes towards Brexit is interesting, because John Kurtz has just written a piece for us in which he argues quite strongly that actually a significant increase in the number of people who thought Brexit was bad for the economy happened after the Truss mini budget. So people tend to lump stuff together. I mean, it's quite clear that there were reasons apart from Brexit for the Truss mini budget, but and it wasn't just Brexit, but people's opinions change on the basis of what they see in front of them, and they're not very good maybe at attributing, sort of linking cause and effect. But one of the things, so we have this number 16% in the report. 16% of those who voted leave say they would now vote remain. And my question on this, I've never dared ask this before, so I don't know why I'm doing it in public, but anyway, is that a lot or is that a little?
That's me.
No, to anyone. I mean, I'm genuinely uncertain, because I can wake up some days and think, wow, 16% of leavers have changed their minds. And other days think, well, it's only 16%. What should I think?
It's a good question. I've never thought about it in those terms. I mean, instinctively, it doesn't feel like a lot, given that everyone thinks it's gone, or very few people think it's gone well. And given the sort of tsunami of elite opinion that it has been a catastrophe, you would think that more people would change their minds. And in the same period, you've had quite huge swings in voting intention.
Yeah.
So I would instinctively say it's not that high. But I suppose the other thing that my partner, James, always reminds me of is most people aren't thinking about politics most of the time, and spend zero time thinking about whether Brexit was sensible. And his analogy is always like, people regret Brexit the way they regret buying the wrong sandwich at lunch. It's just not that important. So in which case you wouldn't expect people to change their mind that fast, because they don't think about it very much.
But you can go back and get another sandwich, can't you?
Well, yeah, but that's expensive.
Yeah, no, true.
You opened it, you ate it, you don't like it. Oh, I can't believe I had a rubbish sandwich for lunch. Probably generates more passion for many people.
Yeah, no, fair. I mean, in a sense, you hit the nail on the head there, didn't you? Which is that 16% in a way is small, given the proportion of leavers who don't think Brexit is going well. I mean, that's in a sense the key to this puzzle, isn't it? Is that loads of them think it's going badly, but only 16% of them think that is a reason to have changed their minds. And that speaks to what you said earlier, Sophie, which is, maybe you can talk a bit more about this, the fact that quite a significant proportion of leavers still think it's going to turn out well, don't they?
The other thing I would say about that 16% as well is that when you ask that question of, if there was another referendum, would you still vote the same way? Quite a lot of people, about 8%, say they either don't know or they just wouldn't vote at all as well. I think that's also quite an important number in terms of talking about how if we had another referendum, how it would swing. That's also quite an important chunk of people who could determine the outcome. But in terms of sort of people who do think it'll turn out well, it's kind of like I was saying earlier, a lot of it is dependent on the political circumstances at the time. These valuations of Brexit are wrapped up in a whole load of different things, as you said, Anand. We do tend to see that evaluations of Brexit are more negative when people think the government is less competent on the economy or don't approve of what they're doing on the economy and things like that. So a lot of this stuff is just all sort of wrapped up together. So if you had, a different government in charge, if you had a different relationship with the EU, if inflation was lower, all these different things some of which are actually to do with our decision to leave the EU, some of which aren't. All of these things feed into people's evaluations of how it's going. So it's quite difficult to separate out. So that question of 16%, it might, if you ask the same question today, it might have gone down to 11, and we're still outside of the EU. The only thing that has changed is things that are actually not to do with that decision. So I think the importance of that percentage changes depending on sort of other circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point, isn't it? Is that if the economy, maybe it's a big if the economy starts performing well, it might well be that a lot of people then draw the conclusion that Brexit is working, even though that might not be the reason why the economy is going well. But actually, there's an important point here as well, I think, isn't there, which comes from the first section of the report, which is for Leavers, the economy wasn't necessarily what they were thinking about when they voted, was it? Their priorities were other things. So it was Remainers who focused on the economy. Is that fair? Can you just talk us? I mean, I suppose Rachel or Sophie, unless you want to do it, Lara, boldly talk about the report you didn't write.
Yeah, I mean, this has been obviously quite well discussed over the years, that this sort of term control was a driving reason why people voted Leave. And within that, immigration was a very big part of the control that people wanted. And therefore, for a huge number of Leave voters, this point, we didn't vote Brexit to be poorer. Well, we certainly didn't vote Brexit to be richer. So I think that's definitely true. I think and that's probably why their sense of the economy is going badly, and going badly because of Brexit isn't driving their vote entirely. The reason I think that the economy has cut through a bit for Leave voters, just to your point about Liz Truss, is because the problems of the economy due to Brexit are quite tangible. So certainly in focus groups, they would raise things like trucks and supply shortages and things that they could really see and grasp. Whereas actually, although they were furious, rightly, and it had a permanent effect on voting intention, it's actually quite hard, I think, for most people to explain what it is that Liz Truss did to the economy. It's just not that tangible.
No, that's absolutely true. But I mean, it's worth at least problematizing that relationship between Brexit preference and economics, because it's not as clear-cut, certainly, as most Remainers would have us think. So A, in the sense that Leavers weren't necessarily voting for economic reasons, and B, just because the economy isn't going well, and just because they think Brexit might be partly responsible for that.
Not mean they're going to change their view.
Yeah, it's not about that. So just before I go further, I've got to apologise, because apparently we had a glitchy start in terms of the streaming. So people joined a bit late. So firstly, humble apologies for that. Those who know me know that no one would trust me with the technology, and certainly I can't explain what went wrong. But for those of you who are dead keen and have joined us now, you can catch the first 5 or 6 minutes on our YouTube channel as soon as we finish. So if you want to sort of go around and watch the start at the end, you can do so. And I'm very, very sorry.
Brilliant. We explained it all in the first 90 seconds, and we've just been wasting time since then.
It is absolutely true. We did explain some of life greats unanswered questions in the first 5 or 10 minutes. I have no idea what I was saying now. It's one of those cringe moments. I will in a minute actually turn to the hundreds of questions that aren't about the technical flaw on Slido, because most of them are about the technical glitch. I won't pose you those.
And Anand, what did you think was most interesting in this report? Like, did anything surprise you? You spend your life on this.
Yeah, lots of things surprise me, but I mean, I've got a memory like a goldfish. I'm very, very easily surprised, in the sense that things I already knew will surprise me a week later. But so several things. I mean, firstly, I think the fact that control ranked more highly amongst reasons for voting Leave than immigration surprised me. That control was so central. The fact that so many Brexiters thought that Brexit is going to turn out well, that is to say that they blame the government for getting it wrong, but think that we might get a government that will get it right, sort of surprised me. It particularly surprised me, given that we've been through Boris Johnson, who you would have thought, I thought intuitively, I would have thought that the feeling would have been, well, if Boris couldn't do it, who can? But clearly not. No one's thinking that. They were the main. I mean, there's an awful lot in this. I mean, one other thing that we should touch on, because it is so crucial, was I was very interested by the section on immigration. I suppose the first question on immigration, I'll put this to you, Lara, and if you don't want to answer it, then you can just pass it on. You get a free pass for all questions during this session. Is, what we've seen a lot of interesting things happening with regard to public opinion and immigration post-referendum, not least a a softening of sentiment about immigration in the population at large, a rise in the number of people who see immigration as a positive thing. Do you realistically think that's because people now think we have control? I mean,
I can't answer that question, but I will
no one can.
It's a really fascinating question, and it's particularly fascinating here in Westminster, not least because Suella Braverman left yesterday, and those rallying to support her in the wake of her sacking, including on the kind of new Conservative and common sense wing of the Conservative Party, have migration kind of front and centre of their concerns. It is within the Conservative Party a very salient issue, and indeed on that, the stopping the small boats, migrant crossings is Rishi Sunak's fifth key priority. It's something they've been kind of happy to lean into. So it's certainly not that this is an issue that is kind of being shied away from by politicians or has gone away. But it's been interesting watching concurrently to that voters' attitudes towards the wider immigration question. I think one of the interesting things that I was reminded of when reading the report this morning was that point about how Leave campaigners themselves say that actually the points that were made were around control. They weren't around kind of headline reducing the levels of immigration. Control was always front and centre of the campaign, and that was one of the big parts of it. And again, like you say, one of the surprising things that you found was that control ranked above other factors for Leavers when talking about their vote. Another interesting final thing that I thought from that was the misunderstanding that Remain voters have around why Leave voters made the decisions that they did and how they feel about this. Yeah. And I think that was one of the most interesting things I read from the report as well, that actually they were very likely to not understand that control was such a massively important, if not the most important thing for Leavers in making that decision.
Yeah, I mean, more generally, we've got some work coming into a report we're doing in December that just shows quite depressingly just what a low opinion Leavers and Remainers have of each other and of each other's intellectual capabilities. It really makes for some sad reading. Now, I'm getting inundated by messages on the Slido saying, can we do a quick recap? So we're not going to replay the first 10 minutes again, but what if you three don't mind, I'll go back to the first question. We'll try again. You're very welcome to contradict yourselves and see if anyone notices. It'd be a good way of checking whether people go onto YouTube having watched this. But we started off this conversation with a brief discussion about the reshuffle. And the question I posed the panelists to start with was, what does the reshuffle tell us about where we are with Brexit and where Brexit is in our politics? So, Rachel, do you want to try and remember? You see, I couldn't remember what I said 15 minutes ago. I'm hoping that you three can.
See if I can remember what we said. I think we said two things. The first was that, and Lara and I spoke about this a bit, when we used to do cabinet reshuffles in the last few years, there was always this parsing of exactly how many Remain voters and exactly how many Leave voters had gone into cabinet. What did it mean? And that was completely absent yesterday. And Cameron's return wasn't really a Remain story. And that is a signal that Brexit is no longer, rhetorically at least, the core dividing line in our politics. In 2019, it would have been a very different story. The second, which was Anand's point, originally, I'm going to keep crediting you, Anand, because you keep forgetting you made it.
I like a good footnote.
Is that if you were either a politician who felt that Brexit was going to be a move to a totally different kind of politics, deregulatory or science innovation or whatever, or you felt that it was going to move you towards a completely different group of voters long term, yesterday doesn't feel like either of those things were true. It was both in basic positioning of the government, but also to which bit of the electorate, pretty much your pre-2016 Conservative Party. Is that a reasonable summary?
I mean, I can barely remember what you just said, let alone what you said initially. So yes, that's fine.
I was very articulate. You agreed with it all.
That is definitely true. Sophie or Lara, do you want to just chip in quickly on the reshuffle issue?
I think Rachel summed up my main point on the reshuffle was saying how clever I thought Rachel's points on the reshuffle were. So I think that was really good. But I also think to Rachel's point that I didn't say initially about moving towards a new kind of voters, I do think, we forgot to mention Esther McVey, but she's been billed as this kind of common sense czar. But many people have commented on her role in this kind of so-called blue collar conservatism. And I think that is also quite interesting regarding kind of pre-Brexit possible lines of voters that could be targeted. I don't know what you think about that, Rachel. I can't.
I mean, the rumor was, Lara, you're much more plugged in than I am, that Esther McVey was a slightly late appointment once they felt that the original reshuffle was not going perfectly to plan. Well, more people said they were stepping down than they had realised were going to.
I hadn't heard that, but it's interesting. I mean, there were similar comments yesterday throughout the day. You'll remember when Rishi Sunak initially appointed his cabinet, and there were cries of kind of, where are the women? I think you'll remember that. And then towards the end of the day, Victoria Prentice was appointed as Attorney General, and there was similar comments regarding that yesterday. 4 men in top jobs, privately educated, etc. But I haven't heard anything to the effect of Esther McVey being an unplanned late addition. I think insofar as it represents or has been understood as a kind of olive branch to the right of the party, it is plainly an insufficient one for them. And it's pretty different to some of, I mean, they're pleased with it, but it is definitely not going to go as far as they would like, in placating the right, who are furious over Suella Braverman's departure.
I know this is not the topic of the conversation, but I do find it completely shocking that just before we go into an NHS winter, we now have an entire suite of NHS ministers who know nothing about it and have never run any part of it before.
God, you sound like the IFG now.
It's really, I know, I've become so, it's just horrifying. I find it really horrifying.
No, it really is. I mean, some of the actually, talking of late appointments, there was a story on the Telegraph website that I think came out just before we started, saying that the Foreign Secretary job had initially been offered to William Hague, who turned it down. So I think it's quite interesting. But Sophie, anything to add on the reshuffle?
No, I don't think so. I think Rachel summarised it all quite well, and I also can't really remember what I said.
I find that very reassuring.
Yeah.
When young people say that, I like that a lot. Right, we're going to turn towards some of the questions. I've got loads more questions, but there's a lot of questions building up on the Slido. And as ever, you can vote for the questions that you want me to pose to the panelists, because we're very populist here at UK in a Changing Europe. The first question is from John Peter, the Economist, who says, at what point does Bregret lead to a demand to rejoin? Is it 55%, 70%? When does this turn into a significant move towards thinking about rejoining? And there's loads in the report about this, but I'll leave it for you lot to pass it. Who wants to go first? Not Rachel.
I'll go. I don't mind going first.
Well,
I think in a way, it's because of the type system, electoral system, it only becomes an issue once a party decides to make it an issue in a lot of ways. At the minute, there's not a mainstream party that really wants to touch Brexit as an issue. You even see that when Labour starts to talk about it, they're very much framing it around the idea of cost of living, in terms of a renegotiation of a relationship with the EU, as opposed to sort of Brexit itself. It's very much sort of like a tangential discussion, I think. So I think unless a particular political party sees any real electoral benefit in pursuing that as an issue, it just doesn't become one, really. I think if even the Liberal Democrats aren't going all out on Brexit, then there's just not really the opportunity for it to crystallise as a particular discussion point. And I think you see that in a lot of people think that these sort of divides that we've got in the country just sort of appeared because we had a referendum on the EU. It wasn't. They existed already, and the referendum just gave them something to sort of crystallise around. I think it's the same with this, and that there might be a lot of that sentiment. It might increase in years to come, but until there's actually an opportunity for it to present itself by a political party making it, an issue in a campaign, I just don't think there's that opportunity.
Do you think, I mean, Rachel or Lara, do you think all these polls we see that say, X proportion of the population want to rejoin, would vote rejoin if we did now, do they mean anything? I mean, they just seem to be blithely ignored, even by the Liberal Democrats. what would have to happen for them to start cutting through into the mainstream political debate? I don't know, that's a dead good question.
I can go. I mean, as I think Sophie's point is the point, right? There's not the political appetite, but the one of the reasons for that is that, and the report lays this out brilliantly, is that that's not the attitude that people. It's not the salient issue that people are caring about when you ask them in these polls. It's not what they want. And even when looking at that section on young people, looking at other section around the views of Remainers, they may think that Brexit is a bad idea, and they may have views that are analogous to polls showing they would vote Remain, etc. But that is a long way off being able to say that both they want a referendum and being able to place it high on top of their priorities for where that would be. And currently, I think it's plainly the case that people don't want that.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think the question is not so much what percentage do you need to get to, but how much does it need to matter to people? Because there are lots of things you can ask people polls questions about, and they'll say yes or no, but it doesn't mean they're going to vote on it. So you'd have to feel that this was the sort of prevailing issue that was going to drive an election, that you could then get through another referendum without it hurting you badly. And it feels like we're quite a long way from that. I mean, in our lifetime, sure, but not in the next 5 years.
And I think in November, Brexit finally dropped out of the Ipsos issue tracker top 10. I'm not sure if it had dropped out before, but it was certainly there in August, September, if I remember rightly. So it's now out of the top 10. And actually, from the report itself, I mean, one of the really striking things was this sense on the part of all voters that they want people to talk about something else, that they're just slightly fed up of talking about Brexit. I mean, that was another thing, actually. I didn't say it at the time, but it was one of the things I found really striking reading it was, it's very easy to read this report where people are talking about Brexit and suddenly get sucked into thinking this is because they want to talk about Brexit. And at the end, it says, well, actually, what they really want is for us to talk about something else. And I think that must be one of the great impediments to it being revisited.
And that was even true in 2019. I mean, that is why the slogan was "Get Brexit Done."
Yeah,
people just didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, so there was that week in 20. I always remember there was that week in January 2019 when the first meaningful vote happened, when the rating figures for BBC Parliament, so not BBC News, but BBC Parliament, were higher than for MTV for the first and only time in the two channels' existence. Which says something. I'm not sure it says anything good, but it does. It says something about levels of interest in our politics. There's a question into which I suspect you're all going to answer no, but it's about whether David Cameron's return marks a step towards a closer relationship with the European Union. But leaving David Cameron to one side, and in the light of the reshuffle yesterday, which is at least a nod towards a more old-fashioned sort of conservatism, do we think it's conceivable that Rishi Sunak will try and strike further side agreements with the European Union before the election? Or do we think he's pretty happy with the status quo and doesn't want to talk about Brexit at all?
I think Rishi Sunak has almost no time, almost no unity, is facing a monumental poll lead for Labour driven by completely different issues. And it would be electorally insane for him to spend the next year trying to do Brexit side deals. I think again, this is more policy than the polling.
Don't equivocate, Rachel.
But I guess that the interesting question for me for the next few years, and this is much for the EU as us, is whether our relationship with the EU changes fundamentally on security and defence and foreign affairs, because that was not the context of 2016. It is very much the context now. I don't know how that could emerge, but I expect that will be where quite a lot of the debates are.
So if you're Lara?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think when it comes to cooperation with Europe, I could see a situation in which, when you listen to, I didn't listen to Rishi Sunak's speech last night, but when you when you talk to people around Rishi Sunak about how foreign policy has changed in their minds since he took office, it was not originally seen to be a strong point for Rishi Sunak. You know, he was a Treasury denizen. It is now, if you look at the Windsor framework, if you look at the deal with France over, you know, the migrant deal, that is the kind of stuff that he and his team will cite as examples of him making good decisions, working doggedly hard. You know, they are some of the successes that they will allude to. So you could see a situation where, you know, Sunak's cooperation with Maloney, for example, on migration, something like that could be lent into by Cameron. I don't know, but there is certainly scope on a kind of non-EU deals with that respect. But to what Rachel talks about as well, defence, security, etc., you could see that.
Sophie?
It's quite interesting. In a lot of ways, it seems like the obvious thing for Rishi Sunak to do if he's worried about the next election is to sort of go full Brexit in a lot of ways, because that was such a fundamental issue to unite in that coalition of voters that Boris Johnson won in 2019. So you would think that maybe, you know, attacking the Labour Party, trying to spin what they've said about a close relationship into, you know, Remainer attack line type thing would seem an obvious electoral strategy. But I think, you know, in a way, that's quite dangerous for Rishi Sunak because of the moves that he made on the Windsor framework. In a way, gives some of his dissatisfied backbenchers the opportunity to then attack his own leadership for going the other way to Boris Johnson and actually pursuing a less pragmatic relationship with the EU in a lot of ways. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword for Rishi Sunak to talk about Brexit, and that's why we're just not really seeing any conversation about it at all. And I think that's something that will continue into the election, partly because of that reason, but also just because, as Rachel and Lara were saying, it's just not a priority for most voters. They just want to talk about something else. So there's just not really the electoral advantage in it. So, yeah.
And we're depressing some people who are watching, some anonymous people who I always think are civil servants, who are watching, saying that we just want to talk about Brexit forever without figuring out how to change it. And I want to come on in a minute to the Lib Dems, who I think are quite an interesting case here. But just want to pick up on one thing that Lara said about Rishi Sunak and foreign policy. Maybe I say this, you know, because of my own background, but I do think one of the fascinating and under-analysed things about Sunak is his hinterland. I mean, he's a little bit India, he's a little bit California, but he's just absolutely not one of that succession of British prime ministers who had a deep personal link with the continent of Europe. You know, doesn't own a house in France. That's not where he ever sort of went regularly. Europe is not Sunak's place. And I think, you know, with things like Horizon, that shaped his worldview. I mean, I know we eventually signed up to a Horizon deal, but I think, you know, having a prime minister from an ethnic minority community with a wholly different worldview makes I remember we talked about this with American presidents. You know, the first US president who wasn't involved in the Second World War wasn't going to be as Atlanticist as his predecessors. And I think in the same way, you know, the hinterlands of prime ministers and the very different sorts of people that make up this country means that actually those worldviews are quite important. And I do wonder whether I'm just making too much of it, or whether people just aren't talking about it enough. But anyway, enough of me rambling on. Let's talk quickly about the Lib Dems, because I never thought I'd say this. I find them fascinating. So the Lib Dems, I think their official policy position is still rejoin when the time is right, or something like that. But they are not talking about Brexit at all. And I remember at Lib Dem conference, there was an event that John Curtis spoke at where he said quite boldly, I think you're being a bit cautious on Brexit and you're losing votes to Labour as a result. That's to say, Remainers who would like to be in the European Union are plumping for Labour rather than you because you're being so cautious. Now, obviously, you don't want to disagree with the person you do a podcast with, Rachel. But what do we make of that argument? Do we think the Lib Dems are being overly cautious?
And you can listen to Trendy every Thursday.
All right, that's quite an
podcast.
Alien podcast.
Yeah, so this is John's view. And it is also his view, it should be said, that far more of Labour's vote share is driven by Remain than people accept. Mm-hmm. So my understanding of the Lib Dems was twofold. The first is I've done some political campaigns. You're always fighting against the previous campaign. So whatever the previous one was, you're always reacting to it. So in 2019, which I was involved in for the Conservatives, we were massively reacting to the 2017 campaign. I'm sure part of it is the Lib Dems are reacting to this assumption that they had last time that Brexit was going to give them more dividend than it did. And I think the other thing that they seem to me to be doing is partly to rebuild, is go hyper-local in their approach. Mm-hmm. Lib Dems don't really have national policy. What they have is a desire to rebuild up the core of what was their kind of traditional strength. Which is local constituencies, and they'll fight whatever it takes. They'll be the NIMBYist and NIMBYs or whatever it takes to build up those seats again. And I'd be surprised if they diverge from that strategy very significantly. You may have your own views on that. So if we're going to have a substantively different, actually change things relationship with Europe, to your anonymous questioner, it's going to come from Labour, and it's probably going to come from Labour after the election.
If they win big.
If they win substantive. Well, if they win enough that they have to do a deal with the Lib Dems, I don't think they'll have a massive problem getting closer to Europe.
No, but I was thinking more about timescale. I mean, don't you need to... I'd always assume that for a real change in policy, you'd need to lead big, you need to win big enough that you can credibly start planning for 2 terms.
I think that's credible, depending what you mean by big. And of course, it would have to be something the EU accepted.
Yeah. And then again, you know, thinking back to 1997, however big Labour win, the natural reaction is to be scared. It's to be very, very nervous and to play it safe and worry about losing next time, I suppose. So on the Lib Dems, Sophie and Lara, anything to add? Excellent. Thank you. That was very helpful of you both. I could spite you now by turning towards Scotland and Northern Ireland and asking about the polling. There's quite a lot of questions on Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some interesting questions about whether the sort of nationalists in Scotland and Ireland will, because they're the parties that are still openly pro-EU membership, will they be able to harness this to help their causes? Do we think that's possible at all? Or do you want to pass on this? Is this...
I mean, you hear Stephen Flynn, the SNP's Westminster leader, talk about Brexit in the Commons. He still brings it up often as to his MPs, and it does almost have a slightly jarring effect when you hear it because it is not something that is mentioned all that much. But to the Lib Dems, again, their focus is on the NHS, it's on sewage, etc. Like, they feel perfectly comfortable on ground that is not necessarily Europe related or Europe facing. And for the Lib Dems, I would say the calculation seems to be paying dividends insofar as they've had some historic by-election victories. They're not feeling any real impetus to be changing tack on strategy there now. With the SNP, there's a slightly different calculation because it's gone, absent Europe from this calculation, Humza Yousaf is asking himself what he needs to change to do better. He is definitely in a situation where something needs to give, and Europe, they've had a relatively consistent position in their opposition to Brexit and their openness with what they feel are the deleterious effects of it. But it doesn't seem to be, I can't imagine anybody around Humza Yousaf arguing that the change in his electoral fortunes and the massive dip in the polls that he has seen and the kind of revival of Labour north of the border, that Europe would play any meaningful part in being able to recover those losses. So in that respect, I don't see that playing a very significant role.
Sophie?
I think this isn't particularly party specific or anything, but I think something that in the report that we saw was that sort of public opinion on Brexit isn't quite as divided in Scotland and Northern Ireland as it is in England and Wales. There is like that sort of national difference in public opinion, and so I think there's different incentives for parties depending on sort of where in the country they are and how they kind of play into this issue. You see that there's just more of a general consensus that Brexit has not turned out well, was the wrong decision in Scotland and Northern Ireland than in the other parts of the United Kingdom. So I think there is that sort of national difference in opinion that's borne out, and so that will just naturally have an effect on how parties approach it.
I suppose we should mention Labour now, since we've talked about everyone else. I suppose the two big questions about Labour that occur to me are, firstly, are they being too scared? That is to say, are they exaggerating the degree to which they stand to lose the support of Leave voters by being a little bit more ambitious in terms of their Europe policy? And secondly, I don't know if this is true or not, but does the reshuffle of yesterday sort of, we have a slightly less Brexity feeling government, make it harder for the Tories to weaponise it if they did? So either or both of those, to any of yours. So Sophie, I want to kick off with you just out of spite. I mean, on Labour, could they be a bit more ambitious?
On terms of being more ambitious, I think you can say that they have been very cautious on talking about this issue, and even when they do sort of talk about the future relationship with the EU, as I was sort of saying a bit earlier, they do frame it around sort of cost of living arguments. They don't talk about it like explicitly. They tend to link it to other things because I think they are worried about the consequences of it. But at the same time, when we're saying they could be more ambitious, how much more ambitious can they be if Starmer's refusing to budge on single market and customs union membership? Anything aside from that really is kind of tinkering around the framework that exists, that was negotiated under this government. We're talking about sort of shifts in making Brexit work, improving the economic consequences of Brexit, but we know that most of the economic impact of Brexit comes from being outside of the single market. So if there's not a shift on that position, then I think, what Labour can get out of any renegotiation is quite sort of limited in those terms. And sure, you can see shifts on things like mobility or on, mutual recognition of qualifications or things like that. But on that main sort of economic impact, it's hard for them to be more ambitious when the two most ambitious things they could do, they've flatly ruled out, and it doesn't look like we're going to see any shift on that. So I think there's kind of that balance that Labour have got to reckon with.
And as Rachel reminded us, these have to be things that the EU is willing to give us in order for us to get them, which we quite often forget. On Labour, Lara or Rachel, should they be doing something different?
Go on, Lara. I'll go after you.
I can't see a strong case, given they are more than 20 points ahead in the YouGov poll for Red Box every week, for them changing tack on anything electorally. There's no clear thing that's saying you have to change anything at the moment. And there's also on whether they will, you would say, well, if you look at those polls, surely now would be the safest time to do something slightly bold. There was a moment, obviously not that long ago, you'll remember it, where Keir Starmer did dip his toes slightly in the water, not necessarily regarding, anything like what Sophie has just spoken about, but on cooperation over migration, on speaking about wanting to get a deal with Brussels over this. Now, that is now widely considered to have been a bit of a frightening moment for them. It was by no means an unambiguously successful intervention. It was a difficult one. There was the immediate, natural accusation, as there would be, that there would be quotas would be involved, as part of that deal. Now, there was a lag in refuting that or denying that, and so that was not an easy time for people around Keir Starmer. And I think as a result of that little flirtation with that, I can't see there being any major shift regarding that anytime soon. And nor, if you look at the polls, would you be able to mount a massively successful case as to why it would be electorally necessary either.
Yeah, and I have to say, the idea that the Italians would sign up a deal to help us, given the scale of the problem that they're facing, always struck me as a little bit fanciful. But anyway, Rachel.
No, I agree with all of that. I mean, Labour is cautious across the board. It's not about the EU. They don't want to do anything that takes the focus off the Conservatives. They want the Conservatives to lose the election. And so they want everyone focused on not liking the Conservatives. And that's their strong incentive, and it's going to remain their strong incentive, I would guess. And it would be a complete nightmare if, let's say, for example, they came out and they said, we're going to go for this bold new renegotiation, we want X. And then through the campaign, you get quote after quote from EU leader, from the Sun's Telegraph or whatever, saying, well, we're not sure we want to offer X. Well, Keir Starmer isn't able to keep his promises, blah, blah, blah. It's just noise that they don't want. I, for what it's worth, do think that across quite a number of issues, Labour could be a bit bolder, not because I think it will dramatically change the election, but because it will give them a bit more of a mandate after the election to do things that might actually keep them in power, because people are pretty fed up with the state of things right now. But I'm not sure this would be the thing I would tell them to focus on it before the election.
No, that's fair enough. And I think also, as Sophie said, if you're going to talk about it as a cost of living issue, because that's where people's attention is, and that's what you want to let people know you're talking about. I have to quickly apologise to Peter Burke because I said the Lib Dems don't talk about Brexit anymore, and he corrects me by saying Ed Davey isn't talking about it, but Lib Dems talk about it all the time. So my apologies for that. Just going back to our Leave voters in the report, if I could figure out a way of unblurring my background, I would show you the report, but that's beyond my technical know how to do. I can't figure out where the button is to do that. So you just have to, I think we're going to put a link to the report in the Slido. So those of you who haven't seen it can link to it. And this goes back to an earlier point about sort of a loss of faith in politics in a way, which is the mood from the report is relatively negative overall, that things aren't going particularly well. Brexit isn't going very well. I suppose that this might be a silly question, but how do we make these people feel that it's going better? I mean, is it simply a question of making the economy work better? But how do we make the electorate feel that actually to be slightly less negative about all this, and Leave voters in particular? Is it just a question of staying out? Is it a question of staying out and the economy improving? Is there stuff a government can do? Do Leave voters want to see this sort of radical deregulatory agenda? I don't think so, really. But what could a government do to make Leave voters feel happier with what's going on? And I mean, that's not just a question of our relationship with the EU, it's domestic things as well. Sorry, that was an awfully phrased question for which I'm very embarrassed.
I think it's a very good question. And I think
myself, so well done.
The fact that we don't have an answer is partly why we're not seeing clear policy from any of the big political parties right now. It's because we're not quite sure what would make a rapid difference to how people feel. My answer in 2019 was you needed to do a lot of small stuff that people might feel was trivial but could appear on the ground fast. And the sort of original idea of the levelling up agenda was that, right? You start to make people's places feel better and focus on not the small stuff, but things like GP appointments, because then they saw something tangibly changing, and then they might actually believe you when you say that you're on a long-term project. Because I think the challenge right now is you can go to them and go like, we're going to fix productivity between the North and the South, guys. You're going to be way richer. It's going to take us like 10, 12 years, but could you just stay with us? And they're like, but I don't believe a word you say ever. So why would I be with you on this project? So I think that was my answer in 2019. Now there's no more
hanging basket, Rachel.
Yeah, I was actually hanging basket. I would say came from the wonderful Natasha Engel, former Labour MP, who did a bunch of focus groups in towns near her old constituency. And all these people kept saying, well, I know the nice towns because the nice towns all have hanging baskets. Why don't we have that? And I've never been more slammed for anything I've ever said than when I said it'd be nice if we had some more hanging baskets. Anyway, but I think that's still true, right? You have to focus on small things before you have belief in big things. The challenge is, like, at least in 2019, there was some money to put in small things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there is now.
No. Sophie.
What you guys do?
So that was cheery.
It was quite difficult because what's quite interesting is because the report was made up of a survey, and then we also did some focus groups. And when we would ask the leavers in the focus groups, why did you vote the way you did in 2016? Quite often we would get that thing about control. But when you ask people to actually say what that was, like, as a policy, what is control? What does taking back control mean in practice? It was quite hard to actually get any kind of tangible example of what that meant. You'd usually get, immigration coming down, or a few things, or, laws not being made in Brussels that we get made to follow, but it was quite hard to actually really get some solid examples. And I think that in a lot of ways makes Brexit quite hard to deliver on, because it means so many different things to so many different people. In a way, that was the genius of the campaign, right, that the Leave campaign ran in 2016, was that message could be moulded to mean 100 different things, but it does make it quite difficult to ultimately deliver on. So I think you're always going to get people dissatisfied because it means so many different things to so many different people. And if most people do interpret that as, immigration coming down, well, immigration's gone up by quite a significant margin since we left the European Union. The composition of it has changed. But, and you can't really say that the government hasn't implemented a stricter regime of migration control, because it has, but the overall numbers haven't come down. So it's quite hard to kind of justify that you've carried out what those people voted for in 2016. And that's just partly because of the vagueness of the message itself, I guess.
Lara.
Yeah, I think, when in the report, it says people citing vaccine development as one of the key ones. Obviously, you wouldn't wish another pandemic to make people aware of things like that. But, one of the other things would be, can you demonstrate that you are making new laws free of EU control? Well, I think on this, unfortunately, the government is actually doing that in some areas, and there just isn't attention that's actually given to it. So on the procurement bill, for example, I don't go on about this, but it is one of the main legislative achievements of this government so far, in my opinion. Like it has provided a new public sector procurement regime. It's been extremely complicated. It's been a really long slog for people, and it got royal assent recently. It's a massive piece of legislation, and Jeremy Quinn, the minister, one of the ministers who was responsible for pushing it through, left the cabinet yesterday because they tried to offer him the housing secretary job, the housing minister job. So that to me is an example of the problem here. Like, it's very difficult, arguably, to get people excited by procurement. Okay, I can understand that. And some of the most important aspects of that you could shout about with regard to national security, for example, the debarment processes and that, they've all been very important and rightfully covered. But the wider regime, I think it's difficult to draw a huge amount of attention to. It's been difficult for ministers that have been involved with it. It is a pretty unambiguous success, in my opinion, for this government. There is a post-Brexit case that you can make for it as having been a success, but that's been very difficult for them politically to land, and does suggest that it's a hard thing to do.
And there's a paradox, isn't there? If we think back to what we were saying earlier about this sort of radical deregulatory approach. I mean, with the procurement bill and with things that have happened on state aid, we've almost seemed to have left the European Union so we could become a bit more like France, which is slightly strange to say the least. But I agree, the procurement bill is a massive deal and is a significant piece of legislation. But broader than that, though, I mean, one of the interesting things about Rishi Sunak is he basically seems to have given up on the large-scale divergence agenda outside a few specific areas, doesn't he? That one of the interesting things is actually when it comes to what we do and how far we diverge, there's not much between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on that issue, is there? No, there isn't, Anand. You're quite right. Thank you all.
Sorry, there was again a very loud noise outside, so I was hoping somebody would pick up on that question. The boat came again. No, you're right.
Good answer. Well, we've about run out of time. I was going to ask you one. I mean, this is the question that people always end with, and I hate being asked it, so I'm going to ask it to you lot. When do you think, if at all, rejoin can become a serious issue on the political agenda in this country? How long will it take? I said to someone last week that I would be amazed if we were in the European Union again in my lifetime, but you lot are all so young, that's going to be a lot bolder for you than for me.
No, I would have a completely different answer, which is, the last political campaign I was involved in was only 4 years ago. And since then, we've had a global pandemic, 2 wars. We feel like we're on the brink of a complete reshaping of the global order. Who the hell knows what's going to happen between China and the US in the next few years over Taiwan and everything else. I think everything is on the table, from total catastrophe on upwards in the next few decades. And I think, therefore, the situation can change incredibly rapidly. I think we are in a period of high global volatility, and this is part of it. So I think it's totally possible whenever.
Excellent. So we might rejoin, but we might be all irradiated at the same time.
That seems like even more plausible, yes. I'm in a cheery mood at the moment.
Sophie?
I think, so all the stuff that Rachel said, in combination with the fact that we're just seeing a lot of demographic change at the same time. In this country, we're seeing you know, because of shifts since 2016, you're seeing a lot more younger voters now coming and voting age who, you know, didn't get the opportunity to vote in 2016, who are entering a completely sort of reshaped politics than what existed pre-2016. So I think, you know, the consequences of that are relatively unknown at the minute, in combination with everything that Rachel said, that, you know, there might come to a point in, you know, 30, 40 years where it becomes an issue once again, as it did in 2016 from the 1970s. So I think, yeah, it's just sort of, it kind of depends on what happens. But I think the fact that you've got a generation for who this has been a big sort of constitutional question that they were unable to participate in does mean that it's kind of bound to come up again eventually.
Lara, you get the last word. You or the boat.
Yeah, I mean, it's I was, before Rachel spoke, I would have said something differently probably, and just said absolutely, you know, not in my lifetime. Obviously, taking a longer view, these things, the debate on Europe since Heath onwards has been, it's ebbed and flowed, but it has never fully disappeared. The question, I think, one of the most interesting things about the report is you have to have, it's not just about saying that you think it went badly or you think we might be better in. It's also about saying rejoining or having a referendum is the solution to the problems that we're facing at the moment. And I can't see any scenario in which any leading politician makes that call in the next few years. And I would be surprised if in the next few decades, they did either. But as Rachel says, things can change extremely quickly. And
you agree with that? I agree completely with that.
Yeah, well, you're going to irritate some of the people on our Slido. So on that note, I think we're going to draw things to a close. Let me say, firstly, thanks ever so much to Lara, to Rachel, and to Sophie. I thought that was really, really fascinating. Let me apologise to all of you for the late start. Technical issues again. They say that good leaders always take responsibility for failures. So I'm going to go next door and blame the office in a moment because I'm a rubbish leader. And just to leave you with a couple of plugs, we've got an online event tomorrow about the E3 and its role, and a conference next week that's presenting some of the academic findings of a series of research projects about Brexit and its aftermath. So look out for those on our website. Look out, he says grudgingly, for Rachel's podcast, I suppose.
And Anand, which is wonderful.
And we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, everyone, and apologies again for the late start. Thanks, you three.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day.